And going there. It says we're live. Cool. All right. So let me get this a little, let's see, further. No, closer, lower, higher.
Maybe I just need to get closer.
Maybe you just need to be taller. Yeah.
That's actually what it is.
I'll let you get front and center there. So I know if Jennifer Elliott's watching, she would be screaming right now because poor Rachel. Let's do this.
That's
there.
Good. Yeah.
I looked all around for that prop, and then as it turns out, I don't even need it. So good morning, everybody. Highly professional here, as always, on Ask the Agronomist. Lance Tarchioni, special guest host, Rachel Willis.
Hey, everybody.
Rachel is my counterpart to the north. And have Heather Freebaron, our producer, here in studio with us at the Bayer Research Studios here in Monmouth. And great to have these two lovely, talented ladies with me this morning, live for Ask the Agronomist. So if there's, I see there's a few people live on here, so thank you. I don't know, between planting, spraying, tillage, maybe filing a late tax return, I don't know who's got time to be with us on Ask the Agronomist this morning, but we love you for joining. So I'll let Rachel introduce herself. We'll talk. We have a little bit of a Kansas connection, a loose Kansas connection. She can talk about her career and history and introduce herself for those who maybe haven't gotten a chance to get to know her.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, Lance. I know that I have a lot of dealers and growers that tune in or listen later to this. So it's exciting to be here.
Yeah, they'll be happy to see you. And I've tried to get Rachel on before, but generally the way I try to get her on is I call her the day before and I say, hey, do you have time to be on with me tomorrow? And she's very busy and very organized and has her week planned out. I just sat around waiting for people to call and ask me to do something, but that doesn't work with Rachel. So I thought ahead, and after the last episode, I called her like 2 weeks early, and I'll be damned, it worked. She's here.
It's on if it's on my calendar, it's probably going to happen, or maybe going to happen.
Yeah. I missed something yesterday that was on my calendar.
Yeah,
that's just me.
That can happen this time of year. So I'm a TA in Northern Illinois. I used to identify as Northern Illinois. I guess I'm the northern part of Western Illinois now.
So you're like the northern part of Central Illinois.
Yeah, there we go.
Central Illinois is like 3/4 of the state, depending on who you talk to.
Yes. So. Yeah. So I'm covered just north of Lance's territory there. And I've been in this role, I think, for about 5 years now. Before that, I was a TDR, technology development rep for Bayer. So I did a lot of small plots as well as strip trials for research in central Illinois. So I covered Lance's territory and then also what was Chris Carlisle's territory, now Andy Mall's territory down there. So have almost actually more years of experience there in central Illinois. I was there for 7 or 8 years in that role. Did a little bit of research, small plot research based out of Monmouth before that. I live around Monmouth, so I used to always leave my house and drive south. Now I leave my house and drive north most of the time. But the Kansas connection Lance was talking about, I am from Kansas. I went to Kansas State and I did my undergrad in agronomy there. And then I did a master's in plant pathology. So for all the Wildcat fans listening, go Cats. Sure, there's a lot.
So Rachel is one of our real pathologists. Some of us just kind of pretend to understand diseases and pathology, and it's great to have Rachel and also Jim Donnelly, who's a very strong pathology background as well, on my team. And so just to keep me from, getting too far out of the guardrails every now and then, I have to touch base with these guys and make sure I'm not giving you incorrect information. But, obviously with things like crown rot and tar spot and red crown rot and soybeans, and it's been kind of, pathology's been kind of cool here in recent years. You've always thought it was cool. Yeah, most of us just thought it just got cool, but it's been kind of a hot topic. So nice to have people with those resources. And you're from like Southwest Kansas. So my mom actually is from Hugoton.
Yeah.
And her family that farmed hauled corn to feedlots in Hooker, Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
And so I've got a little bit of a connection to her part of the state. And then my daughter Audrey, who also made my Trust Me, I'm an Agronomist t-shirt, went to K-State as well. So for undergrad.
Yeah.
So
It's
anyway,
where all the cool kids go.
I guess, yeah. So it's good school. I learned so
Yep.
lots of good things to say about K-State. So anyway, Rachel and I have both been getting tons and tons of questions over the past, 2 or 3 weeks about, how early do we plant? How do you decide when you start planting? Should I be planting? I've planted. Should I stop? I got a call from a guy Monday, and he was kind to me. He told me what I was supposed to say
Oh, I love
as
it when
he's
that
asking the
happens.
question.
Yeah.
Yes, isn't that nice when you do
Yes.
that? So just word of advice to customers who might call their agronomist, if you can give us a tip as you're asking your question, what you want to hear, if we can oblige, we will. We won't lie to you, but if it's a gray area and we can answer the question the way you want us to, we actually try to do that. Sometimes it just makes things easier. So he's planting corn. I can hear the alarm beeping in the background. He's happily planting corn. He's not going to stop, but he just wanted to make sure that I was okay with that. And I was, because conditions were fit. He's in the Mason City area, so quite a bit south of here. And by and large, we've got a lot of really good soil conditions. And generally speaking, if soil conditions are good, that gives you a lot of grace and makes up for things like maybe a cold soil or maybe a bad weather forecast or maybe a calendar date that's a little scary. Our former colleague Chris Carlisle and I, people tried to start a rivalry between Chris and I. It didn't really work because Chris and I, we're not at odds with each other. But last year, there were times people thought that there was going to be like a rumble or something because I was the wait guy and be patient guy, and Chris is, well, soil's perfect. What's wrong with March 28th? And so people tried to make something out of that. But Chris works with a lot of growers that they adopted the philosophy years ago that if the soil's fit, I'm going to plant. And if you've got 20,000 acres to plant, that's you got to do what you got to do. Now, if you've got 300 acres to plant, I think you can probably, be a little more patient.
Yeah.
But I guess what's your thoughts on when guys ask you those kind of questions? How do you walk through that with them?
So I would say this week I haven't tried to talk anybody out of planting corn.
Mhm.
I haven't tried to talk them into it if they seem pretty hesitant, but I haven't run into a very many that are hesitant. The most of
Mhm.
them are just making sure I'm not going to talk them out of it because conditions are fit. And I think that we could go through, it's supposed to rain the next few days. And if you
Mhm.
look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, is saying maybe a little bit on the wet side for us compared to normal. So if you think about that, that puts us into the beginning of May. And once the calendar says May, it doesn't matter. Soil conditions are fit. Most of the time people go. And
Yeah.
so I'd rather them go now when soil
Yeah.
conditions are good than just wait 2 weeks and then make poor decisions.
Yeah.
So that's why I haven't talked to anybody out of it.
We had that conversation with the guy that called me on Monday, and I said, if we have soil conditions this good in early May, that would probably be better, in my opinion, because it's going to come up faster. You're going to get a more uniform stand. It's going to get off to a better start. It's going to be less stressful. Just lots of benefits, but we don't know how long we're going to have to wait to have these kind of soil conditions again. And to Rachel's point, you won't wait anyway, and I tell guys that the soil always gets fit, never fails. It will always get fit. In 2019, it got fit on June 6th.
Mhm.
You started planting on June 3rd, and we planted for about 3 days when we shouldn't have. And then from like June 6th to June 10th that year, it was perfect. So you can always get perfect planting conditions, but at some point, and Rachel's, said once the calendar turns to May, that's kind of the point. We've been patient for months, but at some point, can't be patient anymore. Got to go, 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 go. And I wish we could get to the point where people, don't act like you're a crappy farmer if you're planting corn the 15th of May, in a normal year. And I think we feel a lot of pressure to do stuff in late March and early April that sometimes doesn't end up being the best because we're afraid of it being May 10th and I don't have all my corn planted yet. I don't know that there's anything wrong with that, but culturally, it feels like there's something wrong with that. I made a little list up here on the board of all the things that, kind of go into the do I plant decision. So I got soil condition, and they're not in order, but soil conditions did tend to be the first thing I planted, or first thing I wrote down. So soil conditions, workload. So the workload would be how much work you've got to get done, weather forecast, calendar date, peer pressure need to be first, soil temperature, and then down here at the bottom, I put stand establishment, population, uniformity. So I talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago and Ask the Agronomist. All winter long, you can go to seminars and hear the corn and soybean yield kings talk about the importance of emergence and uniformity and having that perfect stand and the hours and hours and hours they spend fine tuning their planter and getting everything perfect and sorting through seed discs to get the ones that aren't warped, and just the insane OCD planter maintenance that those guys go through. And then this happens. And we worry about everything on this list except that one. And all winter I was getting questions from growers about, well, what do you think about that? You really think that's that important? What do you and everybody's all, just really curious about that, and until it comes time to do something. And then I gotta go. And when it takes a month for a seed to emerge, it's not going to be uniform, because and this is hard for people to, when we walk complaints on emergence, and you've got this seed didn't come up and that one did, everybody's assumption is, well, there's something wrong with that seed. Well, maybe that seed was in a worse spot than the one that came up, or maybe it was a little warmer there, a little drier there, or a little whatever there. It's often not the seed that's different. It's the environment that seed was in was different. And people don't realize that, to a certain extent, every seed in the field feels the environment slightly differently than the other seeds. And that's why they get ununiform.
And I think that's probably exaggerated when you plant early,
yes,
because you're going to have greater temperature swings. And if you swing from, 70 to 75 degrees, that's not a big deal.
Right.
But if you swing from 40 to 45 or 45 to 50, that's a bigger deal for that little tiny micro environment. So you're going to see that. And if, then if you have poor soil conditions, that's going to make it even worse, to where you see bigger changes.
Right. And I've been sharing some information out of our corn emergence risk tool that we've developed. And I like that tool, but it doesn't factor in moisture yet. Now we're trying to get it to be smart enough to factor in moisture, but when it's too wet, which our soils in the spring often are, and you've got an anaerobic environment, it doesn't matter what the temperature is, nothing's growing in that anaerobic environment. So every day that the soil is saturated is a day where essentially no growth occurs. And so those days are just a zero day as far as that plant's concerned. And moisture is usually a huge factor, in my opinion, for us on getting a stand, especially an excessive amount of moisture. And, sometimes, North Dakota and Minnesota and places where it's colder than here, but they also tend to be drier than we are in the spring. They deal with temperature affecting growth. We have temperature and anaerobic soil conditions that impact growth. And frankly, I'm more worried about the too wet, the anaerobic conditions, than I am too cold. It's that lack of oxygen that I think gets us in more trouble than the temperature does. Do we have some questions, Heather, or are you just talking to people? You're just talking. Okay, good. Thank you. So sorry, I got out of the corner of my eye, I saw stuff pop up in there, and it's all from Heather. So that's why it's nice to have Heather here in the studio. She can stop us if somebody puts something in the chat. I'm used to not having someone in here with me, so I'm watching the chat. Used to be I don't pay attention to the chat because I got somebody here with me to help. So that's nice. Think
Heather spoils us in more ways than one.
Oh, yeah. So we may talk about some crop protection related stuff too, since Heather is now one of our crop protection reps, and lots of logistical challenges with spraying. I got a call from my retail applicator this morning before I went on the air. They were going to do some burn down on some cover crop for me yesterday, and didn't get there yesterday. They didn't get as far down their list as they had hoped. I often have days like that too, where I don't
Yes.
get as far down my list as I had hoped. And so he was asking about, well, if it doesn't get too windy today, we're going to try to get there today. Do I still want to get that done? And we got into a really good conversation, same one that Rachel and I had yesterday, about how difficult it is to get the acres covered. Heather or anybody is going to tell you that you want to put your residual on close to planting, either right before or right after. You don't want to put it on a month before. You can't put it on after the beans come up in most cases. So that window is pretty narrow. And then you've got days where the wind blows 30 mile an hour. You've got days when it's too wet. You've got this customer that wants you to do it this way, and that customer wants you to do it that way. That's one thing for me. Doing what I do, I'm a bit of a pain.
Are you a little picky?
I'm a little, yeah, I am, yeah,
Not surprised.
and yeah, and I gotta give some grace, but it's this friend of mine, the retail applicator, he was just really stressed out and challenged by how do we manage this, and I think communication is a good place to start. Keep your have a plan. Don't just go out and plant 1,000 acres of beans and then call them and say, hey, those farms are planted, get to them when you can. This guy told me a story I'll share here on the air and leave names out to protect the guilty. He's got a customer that they have their own sprayer. They do most of their own spraying. Sometimes when they get in a bind, they'll have some custom applications done. And this customer called him a couple of days ago and said, hey, can you spray these farms for us? And he's like, well, those weren't on the list, but he says, your sprayer broke down. He's like, no, he says, we're planting, it's really windy. We're having a hard time keeping up. So, maybe see if you could do that for us. And he's like, well,
the wind doesn't blow.
Am I not going to have the same problems you're having? So it was just a perfect example of this whole conversation we're having, that this stuff doesn't happen by magic, and retail applicators are under a magnifying glass for the decisions they make on wind and following the label and drift and all those challenges. And, maybe we all have our own sprayer someday, so that, we all have the joys of that. I think most retailers this time of year would welcome more of their customers doing their own spraying, because it's just such a challenge for them to get there timely. And all of us, complain about the timeliness and the, doing a good job and, all that stuff. That's just, it's just really difficult. So have some grace for your applicator this time of season. Fall burn down is huge. I've got acres that I've planted that are not sprayed, but they had a fall burn down, and they're essentially clean.
Yeah.
And so that's buying some time. And if I hope the beans don't come up before we get the pre on, but if they do, because we had that fall burn down on, I don't think it's going to be a disaster. It's not ideal, but it's manageable. But when you're planting into a field that's solid weeds, and you haven't sprayed that field yet, that field really, really, really going to need sprayed, before those beans come up. And be aware too that you can't use, until we get to HT5, which would be cool. You can't use PPO chemistry post, at least not their strong residual PPOs. There are a few things like fomosafen that is a PPO that can be used post, which is what's in Warrant Ultra. Plug for Heather. She probably scold me afterwards that she doesn't have any or something.
That's what agronomists do.
That's what we do.
We talk about stuff.
We talk about our favorite hybrid that that's been
Nobody
gone for a month, and we just didn't know that. So anyway, so be cognizant of what you're asking people to do for you, and be sure you're communicating with folks. Any other helpful tips you have, Rachel?
No, I mean, I think that I think it goes back to thinking through the logistics of the whole thing, not just the logistics of the actual planting.
Right.
And, you know, we
That's
talked about,
kind of all we focus on as the farmer, is getting the planting done.
right. But, you know, we talked about, Lance and I earlier were talking about fields where I've had questions on, should I go plant this field because it might not be fit again for another month. But as you're planting those fields, think about, are you going to actually be able to follow through on the spraying portion
Mm-hmm.
in the next month also? So yeah, I think just taking a bigger picture, which right now is always really tough to do.
Yeah. I'll thank my buddy Merle for asking the question that could get all three of us fired. So,
I'm trying to find some official links to share with Merle. We'll let you go first.
So anyway, so the question that came in the chat was, any truth to the rumor that Bayer will be dropping Roundup? So with all the Roundup litigation, I mean, it is a fact that there's no way we'll make any money selling it with what the lawsuits cost. So lots of work ongoing there. We've had some success in some recent court decisions, and working towards a solution there that would maintain your ability to use glyphosate. We only sell about, what is it, about 40%, Heather, I think, of the world's supply of glyphosate these days. So I don't know that China is going to quit selling it, regardless of what Bayer does. And I also don't know that not selling it means that somebody won't still sue you. I don't think anybody sells asbestos anymore. And if you're watching late night TV like I do sometimes, there's still asbestos lawsuits. So the whole litigation industry is a challenge for lots and lots of folks, and people are trying to find solutions to that. So more to come on that one, Merle. But I did see something in Wall Street Journal, probably what you saw as well, that people were mentioning that if it gets bad enough at some point, obviously you take drastic measures, and that would be a drastic measure. So we'll stay tuned on that, and will not be impacting you for the 2025 growing season. That we know for sure. Probably wind and weather and the things we've been talking about will be much more of an impact. So one thing I had on my list for today, I had a dealer call me last week with a suggested topic, and I appreciate it when they do that, because it makes it easier for us to come up with things to talk about. He had gotten a couple calls from growers that, looking at the market's kind of telling you to plant corn. And, with some of the trade challenges and stuff that could occur, that could be harder on soybeans. And so there are some people thinking that by the end of the year, it might look even better if I raise more corn. And, maybe I can switch some acres to corn. And generally that means you're switching them to second year corn, because you probably were already planting corn on all of your rotated acres. And so if you're going to plant more corn, that means you're going to do corn on corn. And that also means that field you've been planting since last fall for it to be a bean field. So that probably means it's a no-till or reduced till field. So maybe you've done some vertical tillage. Maybe it's just untouched corn stalks. And what's the best way to have success turning that into a cornfield in the spring? And in my experience, I'll let Rachel comment on hers. In my experience, some of the biggest corn on corn disasters I've seen are from fields that, with guys that didn't normally do corn on corn, didn't have a plan to do corn on corn, decided to do it in April, and it didn't turn out as well as they were maybe hoping it would. And I think having the proper expectations of what the yield, potential of that is. I generally tell guys to assume a 5 or 10% less yield for corn on corn. Now, for you high management corn on corn guys that do corn on corn all the time, you may say, "Oh, that's bull hockey. I don't lose any yield with my corn on corn." But I think if you start switching fields and didn't have any fall tillage done, and you normally deep rip or do some aggressive fall tillage on your corn on corn, which is a little more common. If you didn't do that, it's going to be different. So this guy's, question was, well, can I just no-till it between the corn stalk rows? And
There's people who do that.
I've done that.
Yeah.
You know, I've got customers who strip till between the
Mhm.
rows, and you know, diplodia was always
Yeah,
terrified me in that system. But you can have success doing that. I've had people ask about, well, can I do spring strip till? And it's been dry enough this spring at times. You probably could have done a spring strip and not made a mess out of things. Um, you know, you could go out and vertical till it to death and make a mixture of residue and soil that gets kind of hard to plant into, in my opinion. So I guess, Rachel, what suggestions would you have if somebody wanted to, you know, create some more corn acres this spring?
So I think it partly goes back to how your planter is set up. To me, one of the challenges, all of the things that you were talking about, was getting to the fact that you need to have a good seed bed there,
Mhm.
and you didn't do anything to prepare to break down that residue previously. So you're going to fight residue, and you're going to fight that seed bed. And so, however you can, I think, like you said, spring strip till would be probably my first choice, just because I
Mhm.
like strip till.
Mhm.
If you can do no-till, I almost would rather do no-till than the vertical till, like what you were
I
talking
would
about.
too, because yeah,
Right.
that fresh vertical tillage is, I mean, you're going to have residue in the seed trench no matter what you do with that
Yeah.
strategy.
I don't love that one. I think that you're going to see a lot more unevenness than and I mean, we've had probably arguably pretty darn good soil conditions for that no-till right now.
Yes, yes.
If we get a bunch of rain, that may not be the case, but I don't know that any of the other options are going to be any better
Right.
than just going in between those stalks. Your discussion on diplodia, I think that's always a concern depending on the year. I think that we have to make sure that we manage it a little bit more intensively because of that.
One question I'll ask the pathologist here, and I get this question from growers, and I kind of had this question myself. I mean, we went through a stretch there where we lived in fear of it because we were finding it pretty bad,
Mhm.
you know, fairly commonly. And that was about, I don't know what, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard much of it, you know, in recent years. I know hybrids changed.
Yeah.
You know, maybe farming practices changed a little. We were doing more corn on corn in that era. But any thoughts on why we don't? As soon as I say we
Yeah.
don't have a problem, we'll have a bad year.
Yeah,
But
knock on wood.
yeah.
So a couple things, you know, way back, like that 10 years ago that you're referencing, that would have been when I was in research in Central Illinois. So I
Mhm.
remember that, unfortunately. And one of the differences there was there were a few years where we had really bad Japanese beetles. And I think that silk clipping from the Japanese beetles caused more tip infection.
Yeah.
And that's not really related to genetics. There were a few hybrids, I think, that were probably a little more susceptible. So you have some susceptibility, but then you also have some tip infection that
Mhm.
probably was not related to
Mhm.
genetics whatsoever. And we have had Japanese beetles, but just not the way
Yeah.
we had them those years.
Mhm.
The shank infection, or the infection that comes at the base of the ear, is more genetics than the tip. So when you see that and it moves from the base of the ear up, that would be genetics, but that would mean that it had infection. Sometimes it can be, you get that by rainfall early on, and so
pre-silking.
Pre-silking,
Yeah.
So that timing of rainfall can also be part of it. And I
Mhm.
think that we've also had, maybe it feels like we've had a wider spread on planting dates also.
Mhm.
And so we haven't had the rain at the ideal time for a big number of acres.
Mhm.
Last year in my geography, I didn't see diplodia, I saw some gibberella.
Mhm.
And really, I haven't seen a whole lot of gib, but that's really, it really comes down to being weather related,
Right.
plus some of the genetics. And I'll be honest, I don't remember the diplodia ratings on all of our products.
Mhm.
It'd be something I'd have to look up
Mhm.
to see, but we are screening. And so maybe we've kind of moved some of that really
Mhm.
susceptible
Mhm.
germplasm out.
Yeah, I mean, I had a grower in the Lincoln area that was doing a lot of corn on corn, and residue burying residue is a very effective way to
Mhm.
control diplodia. It's not something that we really like to do from a cost or a
Conservation.
conservation standpoint, but they were pretty committed to having success with corn on corn, and actually somewhere found a moldboard plow you could
Mm.
buy, and started plowed a few hundred acres for a couple years, and that will fix that particular problem in your field. Now, it doesn't prevent the spores from blowing in from, so even like a no-till soybean field is a good source of inoculum for diplodia. And we often see the edges of the fields are worse. And that's because of stuff blowing in to your field. So even if you do everything you can do in your field, everybody around you is not doing that. So it's not a complete solution. But the guys that, I noticed where, they baled corn stalks off, it wasn't much of an
Yeah.
issue. Or if you did a lot of tillage, it wasn't much of an issue. And that was one thing that in the era where it seemed like you couldn't stop diplodia, even strip till corn on corn, just scared me to death. It's a great system if diplodia is not a problem,
Yeah.
but all that residue is still there. And if that residue is providing inoculum for that disease, and to Rachel's point, you get the right weather and the timing's right, and you got a susceptible hybrid, which most hybrids are susceptible to a certain degree.
Yep.
Diplodia is a little bit like tar spot to me. The most resistant hybrid you can buy is still susceptible. It's just not as susceptible.
Yeah. And I think it's just varying degrees of susceptibility
Yeah.
rather than varying degrees of tolerance.
Right.
Regardless of
Tolerance is a word you pathologists don't really. That's an unsanctioned word with
it's
pathologists,
tolerance, resistance. Yeah, we can have that debate. I
Mhm.
don't think how much time do we have left?
Yeah.
Half
Well,
an hour. We
but
don't have enough time.
just keep in mind what the grower hears when we say resistance is immunity.
And that's why I say tolerance,
Mhm.
because that means that maybe there's some level, some spectrum there, whereas resistance, yeah, we don't have resistance. I mean, soybeans are actually resistant to tar spot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's the
Right.
actual resistance
Right.
yeah.
Okay, so I guess from a nitrogen standpoint, the other thing you'd have to think about if you're going to switch makers to corn on corn is how you're going to get nitrogen on that. And if you're doing spring anhydrous, make sure and don't rush it, especially if you're if you're going to strip, make a true strip with nitrogen in the strip, you're going to be planting right on top of that band. And so I've seen some surprises. Some people who were surprised that they had a problem because they thought they waited plenty long. And when it's dry, which we have been dry more or less, you got to wait longer. When it's cold, you got to wait longer. The deeper you place it, the more safe it is. But in the spring, when it's you're trying to not go too deep to get down to the wet, mucky stuff, sometimes it's harder to go deeper with that strip in the spring. So I guess just be aware that corn on corn done poorly might not be more profitable than a $9 bean crop. So you got to have success with whichever crop you choose, and be sure you think through that process of how you're going to get that seed bed, how you're going to get the nitrogen on, how you're going to manage that. The dealer that asked the question had brought up about allelopathy and the corn residue impacting the corn crop, and he thought that if you just didn't plant in the old root ball, you would avoid that. And I, his question was, doesn't that come from the decaying roots? And I don't know that it's specific to the roots. I think it's just kind of the residue in general.
I think so. I mean, that's my impression.
Yeah.
I'm not a soil scientist.
Now I would agree. It's generally, if you're going to do strip till or no till corn on corn, plant it in the middle of the row.
Right. Don't do it.
Don't plant it down the root in the old
Mhm.
root ball. But I don't necessarily know that alone is going to make you, guaranteed success. But yeah, that's the way to do it. If you're, and when I've no-tilled corn on corn before, I put the old row right on the hood ornament, and so you're planting right between the old rows. And it's pretty, you only need markers. If you planted straight the year before, I planted our soybean plot here at the farm no-till last year, just counting cornstalk rows, and you just line up if you put the old stalk row right in the center of the hood, that means your rows are going to be perfectly in the middle between the old stalk rows, and that's the way to do it if you're going to do it. And the whole vertical till thing, I really, and I know everybody thinks vertical till, you can't go wrong with that, and it's just amazingly awesome. But I really don't think I want 2 or 3 inches of chopped up trash and soil mixed together, 2 days before I try to plant.
It's a lot of fluff out there.
It is. That trench is going to dry out really fast. You're going to have lots of seeds that are laying right next to a piece of residue, and it's amazing how much longer it takes for a seed to come up if it's, only half in contact with the soil. It's kind of in an air pocket. It's laying against a piece of residue. It just doesn't have good seed to soil contact. See, seed to residue contact is not.
That's not a thing.
That's not a thing.
No.
It's a bad thing.
It's a bad thing.
Yeah. It's not a thing that's going to produce a healthy seedling. So getting in contact with soil is important. And, and I don't like somebody say, well, I'll just set my row cleaners deeper and I'll get down to clean soil. Well, then you've just made a trench that you're planting your row in. And then when you get that 3-inch rain, your trench becomes a moat.
It kind of, I've seen it wash really pretty bad if you're on a little bit of a slope.
And you get it just creates when the lowest part of your field is the seed row, and you get moisture, I mean, it just creates an awful environment. It holds moisture there, creates an anaerobic environment. You get a collection of herbicide there. It's just not a good situation. So in an ideal state, I would love it if the field was uniform level after the planter, or in the case if you're a strip tiller, my goal is to have the row actually slightly higher than the rest of the field, kind of like a mini ridge till,
get
kind
the
of
water off
get the water off, and that keeps that row drier and warmer than the rest of the field. Again, back to we pretty rare in the spring if we are suffering from a lack of moisture in these parts.
Yeah.
Hey, Western Kansas, maybe different deal, but
always.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're in one of those places in the world where if it hasn't rained recently and it's not going to rain, we just don't plant because there's no point in that. Can you imagine not planting because you're waiting for a rain? I don't know that anybody's ever done that in Illinois before.
It was an adjustment when I got here, like in 2012. I've been here a few years, but in 2012, I heard about it was very dry.
Yeah.
I was like,
yeah, we only got like 3 times your normal average annual rainfall that year.
Yeah.
So it's all a matter of perspective.
Yeah.
So let's see. We've talked about planning decisions. We've talked about spray logistics. Let's talk about our crown rot trials. Have you planted any of yours yet?
Let's see. One of them got put in yesterday.
Okay.
I think that's the only one I have.
Not to make all of you planting corn like mad nervous, but all of us are planting corn this week and last week because it's perfect conditions to hopefully generate crown rot. So we're trying to do that on purpose. You don't want that to happen on your farm. So in addition to early planting, Rachel, what else kind of tends to make crown rot worse?
Cool temperatures after planting,
right.
Cool soil, wet soil, and then kind of saturated soils.
Mm-hmm. So cool soils ahead of wet, rainy weather and more coolness, and that's kind of why we're trying to get these socked in these early conditions, and then I think too, in my experience, stress during grain fill is kind of the cherry on top of the crown rot sundae there. you got to have that to kind of make the whole thing really blow up on you.
Yeah, I think you can set yourself up with cool, wet conditions
Right.
at planting, but if you have everything else goes perfect,
Mm-hmm.
then you're probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
And
I think that was kind of last year.
Yeah.
Everything
was great.
We planted a lot of stuff early, and it was cool, and it was really wet.
I was nervous.
Yeah. We were set up for, like a 2021 kind of crown rot year. But then we had a lot of moisture through grain fill, and it wasn't hot, and we had really good corn.
Pretty low tar spot.
Tar spot wasn't bad. So we had a kind of a low stress grain fill period, which was, where a lot of the yield came from. And that, even though the root system may have been infected with crown rot pathogens, if the plant's not under a tremendous amount of stress, it doesn't, take its legs out from under it.
Yeah. And actually, when I think about how to manage crown rot, because you could manage crown rot by planting May 20th-ish when everything's nice and beautiful and warm and it's going to come out of the ground. But we've already covered. Nobody's going to do that.
Right.
So the rest of the way to manage crown rot is to try to make that corn plant's life as perfect as possible. And so last year we didn't really have to go to a big effort to make that corn plant's life pretty darn good. But that's how you manage it also. And that's why, to your point, if you don't get that stress, you don't see it. There's a debate on what pathogens cause it. Most of the time we get Fusarium isolated from those samples, and Fusarium is kind of a lazy pathogen, and it's, I don't think it's going to work really hard to take it down, but if it's a little bit stressed and it's easy for that pathogen to move, you're going to see it a little more.
And I think, we've got some work going with a couple universities, studying ground rot and, the different pathogens involved. And that's it's kind of a, we call it Fusarium crown rot a lot because as if it's always Fusarium or it's only Fusarium, and it's really not. You and I have both seen red root rot before, which isn't even, I don't know that that's really even considered to be a crown rot pathogen, but it kind of does the same thing, only worse.
Yeah.
So to me, it's kind of all the same. You've got pathogens that infect your roots. They ruin your root health. The plant's already under stress, and it's got sick roots, and the stress that it's under may be made worse by the fact that its roots aren't working that well. It just snowballs on it. It's kind of an insidious, thing where you've got roots that aren't healthy, so they're not functioning typically well. You've got an environment that's stressful, which is putting stress on the plant, and the stress makes the infection worse, and the infection makes the roots worse, which makes the stress worse, and pretty soon your plant's dead. And that's the ghosted plants that we talk about. And so in these trials that we're planting, to evaluate germplasm for tolerance to crown rot, because that's looking like, of all the things that we've looked at so far, probably the second most helpful thing is a VT fungicide. So fungicide Heather here.
Yep.
Plug for managing fungicides in your corn. A V5 fungicide gets talked about a lot relative to crown rot. It's helpful. It's beneficial. It's generally a positive ROI. Big believer in the practice, but might surprise you that fungicide at tassel time is going to do more to prevent crown rot than fungicide at V5. Well, neither of them prevent it. Prevent's a bad word.
Yep.
It lowers the stress on the plant, which makes the plant do better in spite of the fact that it has crown rot. Is that a more accurate way of saying that?
Reduces the severity. That's
right.
The pathologist.
Yeah. Control is an overused. Control is an overused term in weeds and diseases, insects, everything. We're trying to manage these pests because control is like resistance. It's a word that puts ideas in your head that are not reality.
Yeah. But I think that on the V5 fungicide, we could talk a little bit about that. I've seen that one. I've seen much better standability when we use that when we have bad crown rot. And so I think that it's a good practice, and it certainly doesn't replace the VT fungicide application. I would always always pick the VT fungicide application first.
If you're only going to do one, that's the
Right,
one to do.
right.
Yeah.
But if you're worried, if you have a field that has, if you go out and plant something today, because it's not raining in Monmouth yet today, I don't know if it's raining someplace where somebody's probably
Mhm.
getting rain, but if you go out and plant today, it is cold and it does sit in kind of saturated soils for a while. That would be a field that you could go and you do a V5 plus a VT. So it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to replace anything, but it can be in addition to an application if you're concerned about crown rot. And I've seen it. I'm like Lance, I'm a big believer in using it just to help kind of mitigate our risk there a little bit. The other thing, we both said we're not trying to stop anybody from planting corn, and then we just talked about how we're planting corn trying to get crown rot. So I feel like as agronomists, we're very good at contradicting ourselves and talking about
you're not trying to get crown rot, you just will.
Yeah. But on these trials, I think that in some of my past work that I've done where I've looked at crown rot, some of the best locations are also actually my highest yielding. And so we can talk about the chance to get crown rot, but we can also say that, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have very high yielding corn. Now, again, if you plant into cool, wet conditions, probably be a good idea to think through some of your mitigation strategies, but you can get very good separation on those ghosted plants. And that can indicate from a genetic standpoint, whether or not something is going to have more or less crown rot and still have very, very high yielding corn. Right?
Yeah, the difference just based on genetics is, to me, we can solve this problem genetically.
Yep.
Now, how long genetic resistance will hold against these pathogens is unknown. Things do have the ability to overcome genetic resistance, but we really haven't necessarily bred corn specifically for crown rot, but there is a wide range of tolerance in corn germplasm. And when I was, rating my trials last year, a good hybrid in a high pressure situation might have had 10% ghosted plants, and a bad one had 60 or 70. So the difference is pretty striking. So I think we can make progress relatively quickly just from paying attention to it as we're screening germplasm.
Yeah, there's different ways to screen germplasm. So you can go through and try to, basically, I think what we're doing with that is using observations. And to your point, those observations are going to help us screen out the very most susceptible. You can also go through and look for very specific genes that create or that confer resistance or tolerance or whatever. And that's, when you have one specific trait, like not a biotech trait, but a breeding trait, one specific trait that gives tolerance, that's where you worry about overcoming it. If you just look at something and say, this one in general has the tolerances, this one looks healthier, there's probably a whole bunch of genes contributing to that. And so then I'm not near as worried about resistance. It's not like there's an on-off switch there.
So like with Northern, there is one of those.
Yeah, it's like an on-off
switch, which that one is,
you can see differences
starting to falter, I guess, in some cases where there's certain races that are maybe overcoming that genetic resistance, but that's a specific gene resistance, not a multiple.
Yeah. So when you have the multiple gene resistance, that's going to give you
durability. I think so.
Durability. That's right. That's right. Look at you with your pathology terms.
I've heard you and Donnelly say that word a lot. So
you listen, huh?
I mimic every now and then. So Heather, was that a question?
That's a question for me.
Okay. Well, you can ask them out loud.
Well, okay. So we've gone through the.
We do get feedback. They like it when they can hear the producer talking. So this is Heather.
So my question is, which is a lot about fungicide post. Is there something that can be helped mitigate crown rot via seed treatment and or in furrow applications?
Yeah, and there's a lot of people have looked at that. There's a lot of products that have claims that they can. Our EDC seed treatment, which is on every bag of corn we sell, actually helps. So we've got data to prove that. But all of our EDC treated corn that's susceptible to crown rot still
get
gets
it.
a lot of crown rot too. So what we've seen, and I'll let Rachel share her perspective, is that the differences we've seen with using or not using some of those in-furrow products has been fairly small. And that VT fungicide and the genetic differences still trump all that. We continue to look for that silver bullet. A seed treatment silver bullet would be nice because most people aren't set up to apply in furrow on their planter. And I haven't really found a product yet that I would say is so awesome that it makes me want to get set up to apply in furrow with my planter as a farmer.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've done, even when I was in research, so it's been, 5 or 6 years, we did a lot of those in furrow with fungicide. And, again, occasionally you would see differences, but it wasn't consistent. I think that Kal-El did quite a bit of that as well, and it wasn't consistent. My team is working with, we're doing a few side-by-sides with Minuet to see how that works.
Which is a biological.
It's a biological. Yeah. So it's something different. Whereas, when we were doing the fungicide, it would have been similar to what was already on the seed treatment. And we, like to your point, that EDC, I remember taking notes on that EDC, and you could visually see when you walked into the EDC. So you were, more dead plants, and then you walk into the EDC and you had this like nice, beautiful green sea of corn. So there is a difference there, but to your point also, it doesn't make it go away. I think that, what we're looking at is, can we use Minuet to see an incremental difference there? I don't think that we're going to find one product that makes crown rot go away. I think that's genetics. But
from a fungicide efficacy standpoint, there's so many different pathogens involved. I think it would be tough for a product to have a broad enough range of pathogens that it has activity on. And you've got to, putting it in the root zone that's the right place to have it. Fungicides don't move down in the plant. So even our V5 fungicide that both Rachel and I like to help manage crown rot is not going to go down into the roots and kill the pathogens that are causing crown rot. It's just kind of fortifying the plant, making the plant feel better, making the plant healthier, alleviating stress in the plant, maybe preventing some early season foliar diseases from adding more stress to the plant. But, fungicides don't translocate to the root. So it would stand to reason that if you put it in the furrow and they get taken in through the root, that if you had a fungicide that had efficacy against the right pathogens, and it was there at the right time, which we don't really even know exactly when the infection occurs either.
Sometime early.
If a seed treatment can have a benefit, it's got to be happening early. Because that seed treatment's not going to be there for 2 months. So we think it's, the plants are getting infected pretty young, like SDS and soybeans, which is also a fusarium, different fusarium, but that infection happens early, develops in the root system throughout the growing season. And then when the plant's under stress, filling pods, boom, you see the foliar symptoms. Now, it is interesting that if you look at an SDS infected soybean, even though you couldn't see anything visually with that plant until late season, I've never found an SDS infected plant that had as many pods on it as the healthy plant next to it, which is an indication to me that plant wasn't feeling well even before you saw the leaf symptoms. So it's having an impact on it, but the impact becomes a lot more dramatic when the leaves die and fall off.
Yeah, it can be it can have a root rot phase there also. So similar to corn, we talked about the infection, having a negative effect on the roots. SDS has a negative effect on the roots also. So it has a root rot phase that we often don't see and think that we're good to go because we don't have the right conditions for that. It's a toxin that shows up and causes those leaves to show symptoms.
Right.
So, but again, you have the infection early in both crown rot and SDS. You have to have conditions later on that bring that on. And the V5, the R1 fungicide in corn just helps mitigate that stress so that plant doesn't feel the stress post post tassel. And that's sort of why I'm interested in looking at Minuet, to see if it does the same thing of just setting that plant up a little bit more for a healthier life. I don't know. I mean, I had a couple customers use it a few years ago, and they said that it was a decent, they saw differences and they had a little bit of a yield difference. That was pretty small scale.
Right.
And so that's why we're trying to look at it again, because I think that we need, I like more data. I want some data to kind of show that. But that's the one thing that we're trying this year, is just to see if there's any difference to your point on having the broad spectrum of a fungicide. Is there a difference in the biological versus a fungicide there? And I don't really know the answer, but worth trying on a few acres.
Yeah, it's you can try to adversely affect the pathogen, or just make the host healthier, and might get to the same point each way. It would be probably even better if we could do both. But we've tested a lot of in-furrow stuff, and a lot of the products we've tested are available on the market and used by some people, believed by some people. Our data that Chris and I generated didn't make any of those products look particularly helpful, including Minuet, in the crown rot trials that we did. But other people in other areas have used it and feel that they've seen a benefit. So sometimes it's hard to know exactly where the benefit is coming from. It could be more just help the plant in some other way. Might not be specifically reducing crown rot, but maybe there's still a benefit there.
Yeah. I know that I don't think that he's with the company anymore, but several years ago, somebody was testing it pretty far north. And I believe that he thought there was an advantage on Pythium.
I've heard
potentially.
that.
And I think that in my geography, that's a little bit of a difference between my geography and your geography.
I don't deal with that near like you and Jim do.
I mean, luckily I don't have it near as bad as Jim either. And I think that that's probably a case where I don't expect it to just be an on-off, like this cures your Pythium. But is there a difference, when you look at what is isolated from samples of crown rot, you can find Pythium in there also. So is there a relationship there by, reducing the severity of one, can you reduce the severity of the other? And that's, we're testing it on kind of some really tough Pythium acres also.
When you mentioned that fusariums tend to be kind of a lazy pathogen. They're not going to take down a healthy plant typically. Pythium will. It's very aggressive. And I know there's some people have thought that nematode feeding maybe was increasing crown rot. If there's a possibility that you need some other stress or some other problem or some other pathogen of some kind to help get the crown rot infection into the plant, or help weaken the plant so that the crown rot can infect it. Could be lots of interactions there that aren't well understood.
I think there's a lot there that's not well understood. What we know is cool wet at planting, stress at grain fill with a more susceptible host. That's our problem, and we are looking for I think that with crown rot, you need to think of it as a layered approach. There's not one thing.
Right. It's I know what some of our academic partners that we're working with, they fairly early on in their research, they discovered a new, I guess it's a species that they were kind of excited about. And I'm like, well, we've already got 15 or 20 that we don't understand very well that are causing a problem. I don't know that we need to find more.
You don't understand how pathologists work.
It's like, let's figure out how to control the ones we got before we start looking for new ones that we didn't know anything about. But there's all kinds of different strains of fusarium, and they've looked at that, and it's interesting. There's some strains that are found in healthy plants, and different strains that are found in the sick plants, and so it's kind of interesting, the difference. And I think like if you send a sample, when I've sent samples into the lab, you can find Rhizoctonia, Anthracnose, Pythium, Fusarium. You'll find it's just a witch's brew of stuff in there. And, which one was the primary problem? That lab test doesn't tell you that. It just tells you what's there. Doesn't tell you who was there first. Doesn't tell you who did the most damage. It just tells you what's there. It's kind of like a bunch of kids at a party, and some of them were drinking and some of them weren't, but they're all guilty because they were all at the party. Let's see. March soybeans. So I did get some pictures while we were live here. Our crack staff at Warrensburg has been doing some good planting date studies this year, and their first soybean planting date was March 12th, and they're let me blow that up a little bit so you can see it. So coming up through that crack there, looks a little crusted, I would say. Might like a little shower on that too. So that would be March 12th planted soybeans at Warrensburg, and they've also got, just for your viewing pleasure, some March 15th planted corn that is.
How even did that come up?
Well, we'll look at it here.
All right.
Looks a little stressed. It's not god awfully uneven, but
I've seen worse.
Yeah. So there's some, you can see there's
little guy.
There's your twisted up. See, I got to point at this screen. I can't do it. So there's get your twisted up plants there, kind of that little buggy whip looking, and I think might have got looks like a little bit of nip of frost there too on those leaf tips. So speaking of frost, one kind of, it's a good trivia question for you. If you ever want to make if anybody ever wants to make an agronomy trivia thing, this would be one of my suggestions for a question. Which crop is more susceptible to frost, corn or soybeans? And actually, it's probably not a great trivia question because it kind of depends on how you define susceptible. So soybeans have long been considered to be more susceptible to frost because the growing point's above ground always, and an above ground growing point can more easily be killed than a below ground growing point when you have a freeze. But soybean tissue is good down to about 26, 27 degrees typically for a few hours. Corn, I've had corn get frozen off when, according to the weather, it didn't even get down to 32. I don't quite know how that happens, but corn at any frost at all is just, typically gets burned off down to the ground, but can regrow from the growing point in theory, although I've seen times when that doesn't happen the way the textbooks say it's supposed to. So soybeans can actually take colder temperatures, but actually I misspoke. Alfalfa is 26, soybeans are 28. So I think 28 is considered a killing freeze for soybeans. And if you get below 28 for very long, you're going to kill those growing points. And I've seen that happen, and some year that will happen. The last time we had a killing freeze that caused problems, it was a May 5th, maybe something like that, I think. And there's going to be
beans up.
A lot of stuff up May 5th. So I did have somebody ask me the other day, a grower asked me, he says, do you guys have like, half of the seed that you sell, held back for a horrific replant year with a late freeze and, contingency plan of some kind for that? And like, no.
Now I have a new thing to worry about.
So it's, this early planted thing is fun to talk about. It's fun to do. Great success, but I mean, there will come a year. The worst thing can happen if you plant beans in March is that they're up in 10 days. You kind of rely on them taking a long time to come up when you plant them that early, because you don't really want beans up April 5th, in my opinion, because the odds of getting a killing freeze are still pretty high. And that's a question I put on the board here, planting date versus emergence date. And really, we planted those beans March 12th, which that sounds pretty cool and pretty impressive. But, they didn't come up for a month. Actually, many of them still aren't up. It's, we talk about that uniformity. There's plants that are up that have a leaf out. There's plants that are just cracking through, and there's plants that you can't even see yet. So that talks about that lack of uniformity, and that's lost yield potential. You're not going to get 200 bushel beans with that level of uniformity. And the advantage that the yield gurus have is they're in an environment where they can plant early and get the benefits of early planting. And they've got 60-degree soil when they plant early. And so it's up in 5 days, and they can make everything perfectly uniform. We have trade-offs that we have to make. If you want to plant beans early, they're not going to be perfectly uniform, and they're going to take a long time to come up, and you're going to stress about that. The trade-off or the reward for that additional stress is hopefully higher yield potential. But if you, in theory, this probably wouldn't happen, but in theory, if you planted beans April 1st, April 15th, and May 1st, and they all came up on the same day, I think the May 1st beans would be better.
Because they haven't set.
Because they haven't struggled as much. They're probably more uniform.
Yep.
And it's really the emergence date that matters, not the planting date. But, the only thing we can control to get them to come up earlier is to plant them earlier.
Yeah.
And those early planted beans are always going to be a little bit ahead of the later planted ones, even if it takes them a month to come up typically. And, the first beans that start to flower and the first beans that, have a big enough canopy to capture sunlight, they're going to have more yield potential. And way we get to that point is by planting early, but it's going to take those early planted beans a long time to come up, and you don't want to plant them a half an inch deep to help them come up from that early planting.
No, I don't like that.
Yeah, I sometimes have people say, well, if you're going to plant them early, you got to plant them deeper so they don't come up too fast. I don't know that I like socking a March bean in the soil 2.5 inches deep either, and making it work even harder in that cold soil to get up through there. And you're gonna, those pictures were that's some crusty looking stuff. I think that's probably, and I don't think that's probably a surface crust. I bet that's just hard. And that's a soil that, you're only going to get a good stand from that if you get a little shower at the right time to kind of soften things up so they can pop on through, which sounds like we're probably going to get. Yeah. And we get a couple days of 80 degrees and a little shower. Those beans will look pretty sexy.
I had a text from a dealer reminded me May 9th, 2020, we had 25-degree temperature frost on some beans planted April 12th to 14th.
Yes.
So thank you for sending that in.
Yes.
Better memory than I have.
Yep. And I think I misremembered when I said May 5th. I think that's the year I was talking about.
May 9th. That would have been
May 9th.
Around Mother's Day. I feel like Mother's Day kind of always screws us over.
Well, there's too many sons and husbands,
out planting,
out working, doing something other than honoring their mother on Mother's Day, and somebody's smacking us for that. And we're hard-headed. We do not learn. Not learn.
That's true.
So anyway, anything else, Heather, on the chat? Any questions you have? So I think we've kind of got through our list. I've had fun. Rachel has tolerated me nicely. I appreciate that. Yeah. So I get feedback all the time that your episodes with a guest are the best, and I just think that's less of me, and that's what's making it better.
That can't be the case, Lance.
So I am going to try to have more guests on. this year and try to continue reaching a larger audience. Oh, and Rachel, I'm going to give Rachel kudos for our Dig a Little Deeper series, which do we know what the next one is yet?
No, we're kind of taking a break during
Well,
planting
we're busy.
because
Yeah.
nobody has time to listen in.
Nobody wants to dig a little deeper during planting.
No, we just want to get through it. We're just surviving right now.
So the Dig a Little Deeper agronomy series, I love the name, by the way. It's agronomists like to dig and digging deeper into a subject, understanding it better. I love the name. Did you come up with that?
Sean Evans.
Okay, well, it's another brilliant mind.
Yeah, Sean is pretty awesome.
Yeah, that is great. But so we've had two. Had one on aphids, which was amazing.
That one was very good.
They are available still online. You can watch them. So if you didn't see it live, you can go see it. And then we did, and I haven't watched the water hemp management one yet, but I heard the good things about that one also.
I mean, the message there was you have to go heavy with your residuals.
Yes.
Don't be cutting corners on your your residuals.
Right. Yeah. And that, we were talking earlier about the whole timing thing of, when do you plant, when do you spray relative to planting, and you need to get those residuals on and activated before the water hemp, is germinated and up. They're not going to have activity on an emerged water hemp, and they may not have activity quick enough on a germinated water hemp that's going to come up 3 days after you spray and 3 days before you get the activating rain. They're not going to have any activity on that either. And so our residual products, need to have moisture and need to be on preventatively. And then we, the ones that get through that, hopefully we can control post, but that, we're trying to, instead of the post treatment controlling 99.99% of the water hemp, we would like it to have to control maybe 15 or 20% of the water hemp, and let the pre do most of the heavy lifting so that the post products don't have quite as much pressure on them.
Yep.
So watch for the after planting. I guess
After
we'll have
planting,
more dig a little deeper. And basically what they do is they pick a topic of interest to you, and get an expert, generally an outside expert. We have internal experts, but you get sick and tired of listening to bare people talk. So we'll let some other people talk. And we had who was the guy on the aphids? Really good job.
Nick Sider.
Nick Sider. At University of Illinois. That was super. I honestly, if you haven't seen that one, go watch it, because every single question anybody's ever asked me about aphids, I think he talked about it on that. It's an hour. Or it's
and
short hour.
There's also a PDF with some other questions, because there were more questions that we couldn't even get to. We all had a lot of questions, so there's a PDF there also. And if you can't find it, you don't have it, text one of us. We can get you a link. But I think the one I know we're going to have a Bayer guy talk about fungicide. Randy Myers, he always brings a lot of energy. He's entertaining to listen to.
He is.
So we're going to have him do a fungicide discussion at some point, kind of answer some of those fungicide questions. But I like having the outside speakers. Just they give a different perspective. I don't want it to be a Bayer commercial.
Right.
I want it to be agronomics.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what makes you the perfect guest for Ask the Agronomist, because we have the same goal here, that it's agronomics. We don't even. I very rarely even mention products, and that was sometimes a challenge for producer Jennifer, and maybe for producer Heather too, because they're like, well, all kinds of good opportunities here. Like, drop some names. But anyway,
maybe you could do a special one where you have your guests talk about their favorite corn or their favorite soy, or like just up front be like, this is a commercial of all of our favorite things that we're going to talk about that our FSRs don't have supply on.
Because we'll have to do that soon if it's you, because your favorite hybrid's headed for retirement. So
I know.
Yeah, Rachel's. I've got a grower that says that he wants to be the last person planting 6595
I'll go ride with him
and I told him, I said, well, when you're the last guy planting it, I know somebody that's going to want to come talk to you. So anyway, thanks again for joining us here this morning. It's been fun for us. Hopefully enjoyable for you as well. Everybody stay safe and decide how close to the rain you're going to plant up to.
Yeah.
I guess we didn't really talk about that particular nuance of, when should we shut it down with the rain coming. And for me, it kind of depends on the intensity of the rain that's forecasted and
I think your soil type.
if it's 2/10, I don't really care. If it's 2 inches, that's different. And the way it comes makes a difference as well. If you want to play it safe, yeah, stop well ahead of a rain, and crusting is always worse in my experience when that soil doesn't have time to air off after planting. So when you get rained out of the field by a beaten rain, you pretty well know that field's going to be on the watch list for a potential replant. So,
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks again, Rachel,
Yep.
for joining us,
Thanks for having
and
me, Vince.
everybody take care.
See you guys.